Hello everyone, and welcome to a quick video to talk about the impact of the May 3rd interest rate rise on domestic macroeconomic goals. A lot of schools are getting towards their Unit 3 Areas Day 2 SAC, so it's important to go through how this interest rate rise from aggregate demand and aggregate supply perspective is going to impact on low inflation, the goal of strong sustainable economic growth, and the goal of full employment. So we'll go through that for each of them. We'll talk about how it impacts that goal, whether we're going to trend towards it or away from it. And then later on, I'm going to do another video saying whether the goals are being achieved right now or not. So the interest rate rise. So on May the 3rd, 2022, also my wedding anniversary, so happy days, my mortgage gets more expensive. Philip Lowe from the Reserve Bank of Australia announced that the cash rate would rise by 0.25 basis points from 0.1 to 0.35. The first time in 11 years the cash rate has risen. This was then passed on in full by the four major banks, meaning that interest rates would increase by 0.25% for businesses and households. And there's a lot of extra information that came out about this in the media, where on average, households in Australia tend to have mortgages of around $600,000, meant that a lot of households were about somewhere around the range of about $140 worse off per month. And that's only from this interest rate rise, when there's likely to be more rises that come in the future. Very interestingly as well, there are a few different suburbs throughout Australia, one being Lorne in Victoria, where many households in Lorne have a mortgage which takes up 80% of their income. So any interest rate rise is actually horrific for their living standards. So the impact on aggregate demand of this interest rate rise. So interest rates refer to the cost of borrowing money or the reward for saving with a financial institution. An increase in interest rates means that households who have a variable rate home loan are now likely to have less discretionary income as their interest repayments rise. So after they get their income, they spend, like taxes come out, it becomes their disposable income, and then they pay for anything else in their life, groceries, bills, etc., interest repayments on their loans. So they have less discretionary income. This is likely to lead to lower levels of private consumption spending overall. So people are going to be spending less overall, and they're going to save more because there's a bigger reward for saving. And that means that leakage to aggregate demand increase overall. This also means that there's going to be less injections via private investment spending, as businesses are less likely to borrow to expand their businesses, and therefore aggregate demand is likely to fall overall. So we're going to have lower aggregate demand. And then the flow-on of the lower aggregate demand works for the three goals. So with low inflation, a decrease in aggregate demand is likely to put downward pressure on prices as aggregate demand falls relative to aggregate supply, and businesses start to discount prices to clear excess stocks, therefore decreasing demand inflationary pressure, making it likely that the current 5.1% inflation rate should hopefully ease. Therefore, the goal of low inflation of the general level of prices increasing at a rate of 2 to 3% on average over time is more likely to be achieved as inflation eases. Then when we look at full employment, a decrease in aggregate demand relative to aggregate supply leads to businesses to lay off excess workers as economic activity falls, and production slows, therefore increasing the unemployment rate from the current 4%. That's just theoretically how it should work. Therefore, the goal of full employment, which is the lowest rate of unemployment without causing unnecessary inflationary pressures, where only around 4.5% of natural unemployment exists, is likely to be achieved in the short term unless significant layoffs occur and we go beyond that kind of 5% realm, which is unlikely. Strong sustainable economic growth, a decrease in aggregate demand relative to aggregate supply leads businesses to slow production in response to decreased economic activity, leading to the rate of economic growth falling overall. Therefore, the goal of strong sustainable economic growth, which is the highest growth rate possible without causing unnecessary inflationary, external or environmental pressures, where real GDP is around 3 to 3.5% per annum, is likely to ease back from the 4.2% towards the goal range. In the next video, we'll talk about why that 4.2% is probably inflated in the first place, but that's the main way, theoretically, these interest rate cuts are likely to impact it. Then when we look at the aggregate supply side, an increase in interest rates for businesses mean they face higher cost of production as they have higher interest repayments on their business debts. So most businesses have some kind of business loans they've taken out for their business, and therefore they're likely to have higher cost of production because of that. Businesses are then likely to pass on these higher costs to consumers via higher prices, and they're also likely to slow production and lay off excess workers to protect their profit margins. And therefore this decreases aggregate supply overall as they're less incentivized to produce. So for low inflation, businesses passing on increased costs via higher prices means that there's going to be increased cost inflationary pressures. And therefore, it's less likely that the goal of low inflation is going to be achieved as inflation rises from this cost inflation. For full employment, a decrease in aggregate supply from an increased cost of production means that businesses are likely to lay off excess staff to protect their profit margins, therefore increasing the rate of unemployment. And same as with aggregate demand, means that the goal is still likely to be achieved in the short term unless significant layoffs occurred from the slowdown in aggregate supply. And then lastly, a decrease in aggregate supply due to increased cost of production will slow down production and therefore reduce levels of production and economic growth overall, because that higher cost of production de-incentivizes firms from producing because they want to pull back to protect their profits. And then therefore, goal of strong sustainable economic growth is likely to ease back from that 4.2% back towards the goal range. So this has been the impact of those interest rate cuts on all the domestic economic goals. Hopefully this makes them make sense to you. Hopefully then you get asked about them in a SAC, so then this information is useful to you. Either way, this interest rate rise is going to come up over and over again for the rest of the year, especially if they continue to increase over time. So you're going to need to know basically how to use this information and apply it to the domestic economic goals or aggregate demand, aggregate supply to best answer questions and show the application of your knowledge. So that's been that for this. I hope it's helpful to you. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment and I will see you next time.